clearly, as you say, climate change and by extension, a number of, I guess, associated challenges, environmental and social, caused by climate change. Both buildings and cities have a direct, I guess, contribution to that issue, and therefore have a massive role to play in, well, I guess, firstly, reducing that impact, and then by some token, trying to offer a solution as we, attempt to decarbonize, or the need to decarbonize our economy. On the flip side, climate change is happening, and the impacts of it are already being felt, and will obviously only exacerbate. And therefore, many built environment areas are going to come into contact with and experience the challenges of a changing climate, and therefore adaptation becomes as crucial in terms of the way that we design and build buildings and cities. So you've kind of got this two-pronged, or sort of double side of the coin, as it were, or both sides of the coin, as it were, in terms of one side, the responsibility of the real estate industry, given its contribution. How do we decarbonize, both in terms of the energy that we're using to operate buildings, but also the energy and by that, the extension of that in terms of materials and impact, in terms of the embodied carbon and the mass that we use to create buildings. How do we reduce that to the point where actually it could potentially be a net contributor or a net positive? And on the flip side, how can we design and build buildings which can adapt and cope with, quite honestly, fairly uncertain future, not only driven by environmental challenges, but obviously the social consequences of those environmental challenges. So, big question, and I think, but I suppose the sort of summary of that is that real estate certainly, to use a different phraseology, the built environment, because often real estate perhaps conjures up a slightly different part of the value chain there, but I think the built environment and everything that sort of represents has a monumental role to play in both the adaptation that we need to deliver, but also in our attempts to decarbonize. And I think we're only really starting to see in the last, well, certainly here in the UK and perhaps Europe. I can't really speak to other regions, but I think there's been a lot of talk. There's been a lot of, I guess, steady progress being made, specifically by the private sector over the last 10 or so years, but certainly in the last sort of 6 to 12 months, and I think COP26 has been a bit of a catalyst for it. We've really seen an acceleration of, I guess, intent by the private sector to solve or seek to solve these challenges. That's great, and certainly applaud that, and I represent I guess a small part of that movement. But we need to turn talk into action, and I think while there are many proven solutions, there are also a lot of unproven solutions and unknowns, effectively, that we are yet to uncover and yet to discover in order for us to get where we need to get to. So I think there's a journey of discovery that the real estate and built environment industry needs to go on, and all the stakeholders involved in making decisions and allowing permits and planning and government bodies and financing, and then the actual technical skill set needed. There is a huge journey to go on, such that we can all effectively innovate and deliver the right product and the right cities ultimately that we need to deliver. So exciting time, but certainly a big challenge. The pretty obvious statement is that the pandemic has obviously forced upon us a huge social experiment that I think, for the most part, in terms of the and it's difficult to sort of have an umbrella view on this. But in the most part, things have worked relatively well, with people being able to work more from the places that they live. The challenge therein has in terms of organizations and businesses is, okay, how do we adapt in the short term to allow our workforce to work effectively, flexibly in places that they hadn't necessarily deemed before as workplaces. So there was almost like an overnight need for companies to react. And I think what we saw in terms of the speed at which companies can move when they're forced to move, when their survival is dependent upon it, rollout of technology solutions to support that. I think what we're now seeing, and I think as a consequence of that, and depending on where you are and which part of the world, but certainly here in the UK, for the best part of 2 years, we've been, working under those circumstances. That's enough time to ingrain a certain kind of behavior, a certain kind of culture, which is difficult to reverse out of. So I think, as we move back to a position where we can move freely around, the decision becomes choice, or it's more about choice. And for me as an individual and for individuals out there. So companies, therefore, employers, and particularly, and look, there are two sides of this, but I think, generally the view would be, and I would certainly subscribe to this, if you want to attract the best talent, you're going to have to offer flexibility. And therein lies the opportunity for technology. And I think that whether it's, workplace, typical office, or other some such workplace, or indeed being at home, the need to create a sort of seamless experience, to use that word, as an employee, to be able to work, and feel as if I'm connected to the organization in the same way, whether I'm at home, whether I'm in a coffee shop, or whether I'm in the HQ. There is there's a massive need there for technology to be seamless and play that role. What I would add to that, though, is buildings and office spaces, if that's where you work, are going to become ever more crucial to organizations as a way of representing their brand. And I think I certainly would subscribe to the concept that there are some things that it's almost impossible to replace digitally. We are humans after all. And we need that contact. And so there are some things where, both as an individual, you want to go to office, but also as an employer, wanting and needing your staff to come in, you will need to offer a much better experience to your employees. And I think that, again, technology, both in the way that the buildings are run, but also in the way that you deliver that experience to your staff or your visitors, predominantly through mobile, but other means as well. There's a sort of amenity level, a layer to it as well. So I think technology, both in terms of the way that buildings are run and built and designed, and that sort of reflects on the conversation just now, has multiple benefits potentially to things like sustainability, but also to the way that buildings are run to drive an improved customer experience. But then the linkage with that to me as a user, how do I interact with that space, and how am I getting the most of from that space and the time that I'm coming in to spend there. So I think we're seeing some good examples of that, but quite frankly, I think we're only really at the beginning of what that sort of future state, although that there'll never be a state because it will constantly be evolving, but what that sort of new normal might look like when you're fully hybrid, but you're wanting to make the most and be most productive in whichever workspace you're in. It's certainly going to need a huge amount of integration and kind of seamless connectivity between different technology platforms. And again, I think from a real estate owner, developer, operator perspective, there's an absolute must that they need to get far more familiar and I guess eloquent in understanding how technology can support their product effectively, and how their customers are actually going to use that product And I think, again, in a sort of sweeping statement, generally the industry is quite far behind in that understanding. And so I think there's a massive need, or there's a huge kind of impetus to improve that knowledge, so that effectively, well, we move into more of a product-oriented, industry, that we're actually creating products that people want to use. And there needs to be an incentive to whoever's building or designing that product that they deliver that, because too often in the complex nature of real estate, the incentive and the kind of influences, they're not well matched. So that, again, that needs to be thought through. I mean, there are so many ways to answer that question. I mean, there's the sort of more obvious, tangible ways of, what solutions are out there that kind of help us improve the way that we currently do things. So how do we reduce, to use energy as an example, but waste and water and others would be similar examples. What technologies are out there to improve processes, to make things more efficient, to make us both design and then operate spaces more effectively. So there are some, and a lot of that stuff is known already, and that technology exists in the main already. I would say that a lot of it's been poorly executed and isn't necessarily delivering on its full promise, and there is some lessons in that. But by large part, we've kind of got that bit sorted. I think the more the slightly difficult question to answer is in terms of, and it plays back to the conversation just then, is what role will technology have in shaping the way that we as people will want to move around, and I guess interact with the built environment. Where will we live? Where will we work? Where will we play? And I think that there's an opportunity for us to leverage both technology in terms of design capabilities, but then obviously in terms of outside of real estate, thinking about things like electric and autonomous cars, and whichever other peripheral industry you're sort of looking at, the advances in their technology mean that when we're thinking about space planning, whether it's an individual building or whether it's a sort of urban location, how can we think differently, and what sort of impact will the sort of changing technology have on us or the industry, and therefore how do we adapt and design spaces that by their very design and nature are cleaner, because the example that you gave is a good one. We're working and we're living in the same building, or at least the same district, and we can work or cycle to work. And there are hundreds of other examples like that. And the challenge we have, and this is more of a systematic challenge of I guess the way that our economy is run and that industries are run, is that those industries tend not to talk to each other, and there tends to be very little conversation between different industries that kind of have to play together in order to create the kind of outcome that we need to create. And so I think there's a lot of onus, or there should be a lot of onus on government and municipalities, certainly in terms of like planning, when you're thinking about new significant new developments, is how do we bring these parties together and incentivize them to work together such that we can design spaces that sort of nets mean that we're creating a cleaner and greener space, or a cleaner and greener community. Because I think otherwise you're kind of leaving everyone up to deal with what they can control, and that will only ever get you so far, and you'll end up having unintended consequences. So I think again, there's a big challenge there, but I think there's only so far we can go, perhaps as individuals within the industry, before we need to start looking at, I guess, cities and urban spaces more in a sort of system way, and getting the right stakeholders around the table to think about, okay, how do we do this differently?